right, in this video, I want to really break down all the cueing that can make your hip hinges exponentially more effective. So I prescribe hip hinges all the time in the clinic for rehab, as well as incorporate them into gym training programs. I think they have a lot of merit when it comes to increasing power in the hips, retraining our body to recruit from the hips versus the low back, lengthening and mobilizing the back of the hip, and then really strengthening the posterior chain. However, I find that a lot of clients really struggle with mastering a hip hinge and really doing it well. And there's a few tweaks that you can make to really get the most out of them. So what we're gonna do in this video is we're gonna cover everything from the feet all the way up to the spine as far as what you should be feeling or cueing, and then how that plays a role into how your body is hinging. I'm also going to share with you a couple correctives that I frequently use to really improve and clean up a hip hinge. So at its most fundamental level, what a hip hinge is we're basically moving the pelvis. We're not seeking spine movement, we're not seeking knee movement, we're not seeking foot movement. We're really wanting to fix everything else in place, and then it's just our pelvis that is moving as we hinge. So if we start from our feet up, what I see commonly is going to be as someone shifts their weight back to start hinging, they're going to sink back on the heels. They're going to lose contact at the front of the foot. I'll even see people's toes come all the way off the ground. And then when that happens, the knees tend to straighten too. That is less than ideal. What a lot of people will say is they feel like they're getting more tension on the back of the hamstrings with that. What I believe to be happening is as we straighten out here, we're really just getting more nerve tension than anything. But it's essentially taking tension off of the back side of the hip capsule, which is what we really want to mobilize in a hinge. So when your body moves into a hinge, what is happening is we're getting that ball of the ball and socket. It's gliding back as the pelvis rotates around. So we're getting some really nice mobilization to the capsule on the back side of the joint. But we've got to be really specific about what our feet are doing, because the feet are going to feed the hip. So what we want to see is most of the body weight's actually going to be forward on the foot through the forefoot and the arch. If you're in shoes, it may be difficult for you to get that feedback. So when I'm training the hip hinge, oftentimes I'll have people remove their shoes. At worst case, if you're at a commercial gym and you can't go barefoot, just getting into like a minimalist shoe will help. Something that is zero drop, has a nice wide toe box because we need the foot to be able to splay, and then something with a relatively thin sole that you still can get some feedback from the ground. So what we want to see is we want to see the toes kind of splay open nice and long, and then we want to keep our weight forward on our feet here. The other cue that I like to give, because what I'll see for a lot of people is once they get back into the hinge, they're going to ride onto the outside of their feet. And I think that's a lot of people's way of gaining stability. We tend to sit in a little hip external rotation, which means we're kind of pulling tension to the outside of the body. But really what I like to see at the bottom of a hinge is I want to see that joint at the base of the big toe and the inner part of the arch really firmly in contact with the ground. That's going to bias us ever so slightly into a little hip internal rotation, which again is going to help tension that joint capsule. It's also going to start firing our adductor muscles and our medial hamstrings, all of which tend to be a little bit weak on most people. Some cueing or some correctives that I like to give if people are struggling with this is doing some heel float exercises, especially if people aren't really used to loading that forefoot. Doing some things where maybe we're getting into a hinge and then we're just letting those heels hover and float off of the ground at the same time that we're kind of driving weight through our forefoot, but keeping the toes nice and long. You can do that from a hinge position. You can do it from a lunge position. Basically anything where we're working on kind of that heel float movement will get people used to distributing that body weight forward on the foot. So once we get our feet set up how we want, toes are spread nice and long, we've got weight forward on our feet, let's move up to the knee. So ideally, if we're just doing a strict hip hinge, the angle of our knee joint is not going to change. So I like to set people up with a soft knee bend with a slight positive shin angle, meaning my shin is going forward. And then as I move the hips, that knee angle shouldn't change. What I see with a lot of people is they kind of do one of two things. First off, they're either going to ride back on their heels and straighten their knee, or they're going to kind of turn their hinge into a squat, in which case as they go to hinge back, they're also bending their knees, squatting down, and then when they go to extend up, whereas it should be just hip extension, they're also extending through the knees. So they're unable to disassociate that movement from the knees from the hips. So we want to really clean that up here. So what I'm cueing is once we get the feet set up, soft bend in the knee, keep a little bit of that forward shin angle, then we're going to go ahead and work on the hinging. And then moving up the chain, if we go to the pelvis next, and this is where I feel like a lot of people get super confused, is we actually want to be in a bit of an anterior pelvic tilt with a hinge. That's going to be the most optimal way to really lengthen and load the back side of the hip. If you're not sure, about your pelvic position, and a lot of people may know, anterior, posterior pelvic tilt, but they're unable to connect with that movement in their body. So I'll have people just start with standing. So to start with, you're going to just do a gentle lower abdominal contraction. You're going to slightly tuck your tailbone. That would be a posterior pelvic tilt. And then for an anterior pelvic tilt, you're going to dip that pelvis forward, lift the tailbone. This is what we want at the bottom of our hinge. What a lot of people do, and I see this especially with men, is as they hinge back, they're actually going to stay in a posterior pelvic tilt, in which case the low back is going to be biased to some flexion and rounding. Those hips are tucked under. We're really not able to optimally load the back of the hip here, and we potentially now are doing unnecessary loading through the low back. So what we want to be able to do is get you comfortable at the bottom of your hinge being in a slight anterior pelvic tilt. So sometimes I'll have people even get into a hinge, hands on the knees, and then just kind of work on posterior pelvic tilt. That should untension the hamstrings back of the hip. And then gently lift that tailbone, anterior pelvic tilt, and then you should feel a ton of tension here. That's what we want. So let's recap everything we've done so far. We have got our feet nice and long and splayed. We've got weight forward on our foot, soft bend in the knee, slight anterior pelvic tilt. As we go to hinge back, we're really thinking about lifting the glutes, lifting the hamstrings. At the bottom of our hinge, which is basically going to be limited by this mobility, if I were to keep going, I would have to pull from my low back. We want to disassociate back from pelvis here. So you've got to get comfortable with find your range of motion. That's your limiting factor. Once we're here at the bottom of the hinge, I'm then going to ask people, are you heavy on the outside of your feet? And a lot of people are, in which case we're going to bring some awareness to those joints at the base of the big toe. And then once we get that set up, then we start looking at motor recruitment pattern. So I see this all the time with low back pain, as people will get into their hinge, and then when we go to stand up, ideally this movement, we've now loaded the glutes and hamstrings, all these powerful hip extensors, but people with ongoing back issues, instead of recruiting from here, They're gonna contract the muscles that run along the spine, and that first movement is gonna be them initiating that movement from the low back, then drive the hips forward. And so they're programming kind of in reverse. We want the hips to be that primary driver. So we want to come here. Once we get all our weight distribution set up, I'm going to have people think about really squeezing their cheeks together, and then think about just sending those hips forward. Don't necessarily think about bringing the chest up. And then at the top of our movement, we don't want to go into hyperextension, which again is another less than ideal movement pattern I see a lot. And then if we work our way up to the spine, so we know that we want to disassociate movement from the pelvis and the spine here. We want to move from the hips. We want to be aware of, we want our spine to stay nice and long. Ideally, we're kind of keeping the ribs stacked over the pelvis here. If I were to crumple down and kind of flex forward, I'm going to be biased to a lot of lumbar flexion and that posterior pelvic tilt as I come. So the corrective that I like to use, if that's what I'm seeing, is I'll get a light med ball, have someone rack it at their chest, lift up. That's gonna cue that long spine. They can also do it arms across here, lift those arms up, and then as they come into their hinge, they're gonna keep lifting those arms up. That will cue that spine to stay nice and long. And then the last thing is if we move up to the neck. We do want to keep a neutral neck posture, meaning the ears over the shoulder. I'm kind of looking at the ground maybe about 4 feet ahead of me. If I were to crank my head up here, I'm going to bias my spine into extension, which is going to mean I'm already predisposed to contracting the low back to initiate this extension. So we want to keep that head and neck neutral, those deep neck flexors slightly engaged here. So hopefully this helps. It can be a lot of nuance. I know if you are learning how to do a hip hinge, I would start at the feet. That's the most important thing. Get that weight distribution correct. Work your way up. If you're working with clients, hopefully these were some helpful coaching cues. Don't get frustrated if you're working through this, whether on yourself or with someone. I have spent many one-on-one, 1 hour long sessions with people, sometimes for several weeks on end before it finally clicks. That's why you have to have a large exercise base in your repertoire of different setups, different loads, different cues. Everyone responds to something a little bit different, but these are the biomechanics of what we want to see to get a really good and effective hip hinge.